Well, welcome again to the AQS studio, and boy do we have a fun panel to work on today. This is our class 6 panel quilts in 6 weeks, and this is lesson number 5. And golly, I don't know about you, but I loved working on this panel. And we're able to bring you these classes at no charge. We bring them to you on Facebook and on YouTube because we have some great sponsors who provide both the products that we're using here in the studio, but also some great prizes for you all to register for. And that includes Bernina with the B770 Quilters Edition machine, Branson, Missouri, where we'll be having a show in March, Ironmatics Ironing Board, who is a new sponsor of ours, and they have a terrific board. Tracy's Tables, providing the equipment here and giving somebody a cutting table, and Star Forest Quilts, and that's the panel that we worked on in our last lesson. So once in a while, we get a surprise. And yesterday, when the deliveries were made here to the office, we received a brand new, the very latest Panasonic iron. This is a cordless iron, and I haven't looked at it yet, so I'm going to pull it over here, and we're just going to unwrap this. And the one thing I know about it is that it is my favorite color. And you see how it comes in its own carrying case. And so it's real easy to lift it off. It's teal. Of course I would like that, wouldn't I? All you have to do is watch the way I dress, the fabrics I use in my quilts, and you'll know that teal is one of my very favorite colors. And you can see that this iron has its own docking station, so that you've got a double-ended iron, and it has a very easy to fill spout. And I'll tell you what, I have some water right here, and I'm going to do that for you. And you can take this right over, I take mine at home right over to my faucet and fill it. Quite a ways, and yet not run over in my lap here. And so that just goes down. It has its own storable cord right here on the side. So we're going to put that in place back here, so I'll be able to use it in just a few minutes. We're going to turn it on and get it heating. And this is great if you ever have to take your iron anywhere, or if you just want to keep it so that you keep it dust-free, put the lid right back on it. Okay, and you can have one of these turquoise irons for your very own. You can get those by going to AmericanQuilter.com and look for the shop button. And I don't know if you all have noticed, but we have a brand new website, so I hope you'll spend a little time just scrolling through some of the buttons at AmericanQuilter.com. We've combined everything into one website now, so it'll make it easier for all of us to use and get the information we need. All right, let's go on and work on this Tuscan Poppies, and this is some fabric from Timeless Treasures. So in today's panel, we're going to do some splicing. And I know that you've seen a number of variations of these. Sometimes they cut off parts of the top and parts of the bottom. I decided that I liked this panel just the way it is, with the yellow at the top and the big poppies at the bottom, and that I was just going to frame that with black. And just like I've shown you on some of the other lessons, I used electric quilt to go in and play to see what I wanted to do. For fabric, I bought the companion print that went with the panel, and then all I needed was black fabric to do my first and third borders. Now, if you look at this companion print, you'll see it has 2 border prints on it. And if you're buying a border print, the one thing you need to make sure that you do is make sure that there are 4 of the one that you want to use that go across the fabric. And usually there are 2 on one side and then 2 on the other side. I think they're printing them, most of them that way now, but there might be some older prints out there that only have 3 of one and 2 of another, just because it's been printed maybe earlier. Now they know we need 4 of these because our quilts have 4 borders on them, don't they? And you never know how big those borders need to be. Okay, so I played first of all with the wide border because I thought, man, I love the big poppies in that wide border. So I went into Electric Quilt and dropped it in, and so that's what it looks like. Then I went on and I added the narrow border, and oh my gosh, you know, this is the one that sang to me. And there's another reason why I chose the narrow border is because the repeat on this big one is 11 inches. That's a big repeat, and it's a big design. The repeat on the smaller border is only 6 inches. And we're going to need to know that number because that's going to help us size the inner border before we put this print border on. Okay, all right, so now I've decided on that design, and when you do a spliced quilt like this, the first thing that you always have to ask yourself is, what size should I make those slices? Should they be even? Should they be wide and then narrow and then wide? And I think you'll see people are doing some of all of that, but I thought I would use the Fibonacci sequence. And if you aren't familiar with that, I printed it out here, and so it's like 0 and 1, and then you add those together and you get 1, and then you add 1 and 1 and you get 2, and you add 1 and 2 and you get 3, and so you just keep, and so it goes 5, 8, 15, 23, and you know, this is something we see in nature a lot. Think about the design on a pineapple, a pine cone. Sometimes there are plants that grow in the Fibonacci. Ferns, a lot of times, you'll see them all curled up. It'll be like the Fibonacci sequence. And so that's what I started with because I knew if I used those proportions, it would look good. And I didn't have to play around and figure out, okay, do I like it with 2, 4, 6, and 8? This is something we see all the time, so that's why I chose the Fibonacci sequence. Now, let me just slide over here and let's look at this narrow border. I told you the narrow border was a 6-inch repeat. And how do we find that repeat? Well, so you look for a design, and so like here I have a leaf point, and where do I find the next identical leaf point is right there. So if I were to measure from, get my on 0 here, from one leaf point to the next, you can see that that's 6 inches. So that's my repeat. Okay, so now what happens when you put it in the border of your quilt? Sometimes you want to have it so that it works out even, and that's what I want. So when we get ready to put this border on, I want it to be a multiple of 6. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to measure our panel. Now my panel, one repeat, this is a little more than a whole panel that I'm using in this particular quilt. And so you can see that I've repeated a little of this from here, okay? And so I have a few more inches wider than it normally would have been. If you buy a panel that's like 28 by 42 or 43, you want to, on your downloadables, make note of those dimensions. And you also want to write down whatever the repeat is if you're going to use a border print. All right, so I'm going to reset my stage here just a little bit, and we're going to take a word from our sponsors, and we'll be right back, and we're going to talk about how we do the splicing of this panel.
Tracy's Tables has all of your custom sewing table needs. Visit tracystables.com to see the complete line of unique tables, carts, and shelves. And all of Tracy's tables are made in the USA.
Sonic.
Okay, so I told you that mine measured 28, but I went ahead and made it so it was like 32 inches. And I folded my panel in half so that you were matching the selvages, the top and the bottom. And the next step that we need to do then is to draw lines for us to be able to slice the quilt. Well, I knew that I wanted the center slice to be 8 inches. So if you look at this drawing, you can see the lines that I've drawn on here. From the fold of the fabric, I measured 4 inches and drew a white line, a chalk line, from the top to the bottom. Then I measured 5.5 inches. Okay, so I know I told you that the Fibonacci is like 1, 2, 3, 5, 8. Well, the first decision I made was I wanted my center panel to be 8 inches. In order to make sure that my dimensions came out right in a multiple of 6, which is the repeat on my border print, I knew I had to get to probably 36 inches. Would either be 24 or the next one would be 30 and then 36. And so I decided that I would go for 36. Well, when I did that, you take off the 6-inch border that I'm going to put around the center of it. That means my panel needs to measure 30.5 inches. So I came back in here and I added 1/2 inch on some of these sections so that instead of this ending up 28 inches, it's going to add in those 2 extra inches, gives me my 30 inches. So once we've done that, then we're going to mark our design. And so we're going to start with the 8-inch section in the center, and it's on the fold, so I'm going to draw it at 4 inches. The next one is going to be at 5.5 inches from the previous line. From the 5.5 inch line, we're going to draw a 3.5 inch section, and that's what I have right here. And then we're going to have a 2-inch section. But on this last section, you want to make sure that you add a seam allowance. And so this is half of the seam allowance for the whole panel. So this one needs to be 2.25 inches. I've gone ahead and sewn these strips into this panel. It took me a whole afternoon, and that was from cutting the black strips, drawing the lines, splicing it, and sewing it in. And so for the class today, I'm going to just sew one of these for you so that you can see what I did, because they were all identical. Now, the one thing that you don't want to do is that you want to make sure you leave these selvages on until you get all of the splices sewn in. And I'll tell you why. Is that that's an easy way. Do you see here how my pattern matches right here? You know, the design? All right, so what happens when I take 1/2 inch out of there, let's see, let's get it on a line and then I can actually show you. We're going to add a black section in there, and you want to make sure that even though this is going to be black in the middle, your design is going to continue on and it'll look just like you want it to, and it's going to work really well. So make sure you leave those selvages on until you get all of the splicing sewn in, and then you're going to go back and measure the width and the length and cut the dimensions that you need it to be. Once you get your lines all drawn, and I told you we folded the fabric in half, so when we cut it, we can cut both sides at once. And so you're going to have 2 1/4, 3 1/2, 5, 8 in the middle, 5, 3 1/2, and 2 1/4. So you're going to slice those, and then you just have to remember that you've got 2 sections at a time that you're doing, because we folded it in half, didn't we? So you're going to lay one out here, this one, and then you're going to lay the other one on the opposite side. And the next one would be 3 1/2, and then we'll have another 3 1/2, 5 1/2, 5 1/2, and the 8-inch one goes down the middle. So once we've done that, then we're just about ready to sew. And you just have to cut yourself 6 1-inch strips of black fabric or some dark fabric. And we're going to take a word from our sponsors, and when we come back, I'm going to show you how I sewed those together.
The Ironmatics Space Saver is an award-winning ironing board. It's ergonomic and user-friendly. Strap your iron directly to it and hang it behind a door or in a wardrobe to keep it hidden out of the way. Visit ironmatic.com to get yours today.
Okay, now we are ready to sew the splice into the panel. And I've cut my long strips, my splice strips, the same length as the panel. And so all I did was I folded it in half, and then I came back and I cut it so that it would be exactly the same length. I've done like I always do, and that is I've divided with a pin the splice in half, and I also have one here in the panel itself. And I'm going to start by putting, and you know, you always want to double check to make sure you picked up the right side. It's got to be between these two pieces, so I need to make sure that I'm picking up this end right here and find my center point, right sides together. And it isn't real critical that you pin this, but you know me, I always do. It's better to be safe than sorry. So I'm going to lay it out here on the table. I'm going to pin this end of it. Since we cut these exactly the same size as the strips. And normally I have the guide on my machine here for the 97D foot. So I'm going to pin this so that the pins are on my left and I don't have to stop every time. And so you don't need very many pins. That should be enough for that half. Then we're going to do exactly the same thing with the other half. Now I'll tell you, I bought 2 yards of the black fabric. And the reason I bought 2 yards of the black fabric was so that I would not have to splice any of my black strips, either for the splices or for the borders. You won't quite use 2 yards, but to me that was a whole lot easier than having to do a lot of splicing. You can see the guide that I have here on the machine. That gives me a really accurate 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I put the pins over here so that I can reach just like this and get rid of those pins. And you will notice that often I will just pick this up and make sure that I have that splice right on the edge of the panel fabric. And of course, you know, I like to use the thread savers, so I'm just going to pop that off of there and stitch across it. And then you don't have to hold your threads when you get ready to go again, and you're all set to go. Okay, so the next step is we need to press this. Our iron's all heated up. So the first thing I'm going to do is set the seam. I'll tell you that does 2 things when you set that seam. First of all, it's going to just kind of meld those stitches right into the fabric. But also, once you heat up this fabric, it'll be a lot easier for you to press it over. So I'm just going to press from the top, and I often press from the top because sometimes when you press from the back, you get that little pleat right here in your seam line. And if I'm going to do it like this, I can take the nose of that iron, and sometimes I might want a little steam, and I can just push that button. Okay, so now, and I'll tell you what, I always bring it back and lay it out. And this one's pretty easy because we have yellow at the top. So now I'm going to flip it over and make sure that I've got it on the right side of the next section. Oh, before I do that, I want to put myself a pin in here to mark that center. And I'm going to want to come back and do exactly the same thing here. Okay, so now I can lay it out, put it on top, and pick it out and make sure I've got the right orientation. So again, we're going to match the centers. Going to match the ends. And do you see, because I've left that selvage on there, I can actually match up that selvage right across the end of my quilt. Again, I'm going to bring it to the other end and make sure that lines up. Okay, now I'm ready to sew again. Oh, something that we do a little bit different when we get ready to sew the second panel. Do you know how when you sew line after line after line, going from the same direction? Well, we want to flip this around. Since we sewed from the top down, on the other side of this splice, I'm going to turn this over and I'm going to sew from the bottom up. Now, because since I pinned this wrong, I'm going to have to pay attention to where my pins are here. And again, I'm going to peek and make sure I'm right on. You only have a ½ an inch to play with here, so you want to make sure that you are taking an accurate seam allowance. Even though I pinned that wrong, I can feel those pins with my left hand, so I'm able to get in there and get them out of the way. Do you know, after the last class, someone wrote me and said, "Boy, you really sew fast." Well, I can tell you, I'm not a speed demon, but when you're just sewing straight lines and you've got a guide like this, it makes it easier. But also, Alan can be the magic of video and speed it up. So sometimes it's faster than I really am sewing. Okay, so now we're ready to press this again. And I will tell you that when I pressed this one, I did press it from the back, and then we'll go back and press it on the front, but I'm going to use my hand as a guide because I'm going to press those seam allowances in the same direction. And so I'm just tugging with my left hand a little bit just to make sure that we're not getting any of those pleats on the front side. Okay, so now we're going to just do a really good pressing from the front. Okay, so now you can see I've sewn all of those together, And this would be this side. Okay? Same orientation. Plan on an afternoon of stitching and cutting and stitching to do this section of your spliced quilt. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add on the first border, and when we come back we'll measure our panel and put that first border on.
As any artist will tell you, hitting the perfect notes means finding the perfect instrument. Bernina. So get the machine that always hits the right chord and start making beautiful music together. Bernina, made to create.
All right, so now once you have the splicing all done, then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to measure from one edge of your panel with the splices to the other so that we know what size to make the top and bottom borders. Now, I will tell you that when I measured mine, it should have been 30.5 inches, and it wasn't quite 30.5 inches. So I came back and I repressed all of my splices, and sure enough, there was one that just had a little bit of a pleat in it, and it doesn't sound like much, but a 1/16 of an inch pleat would be double, and so that would be like an 1/8 that you could be off. So if your measurements don't come out the way, I would just recommend that you come back and repress the whole thing and make sure that you don't have any pleats here along our seam lines. Now, I have already gone ahead and sewn the top and bottom borders on, and I cut those 3.5 inches by 30.5 inches, which is what my dimension was, okay? And I've sewn off on the, I guess this is the left border, and so now I'm ready to sew on the right border. And like I always do, I have marked my border, and so I measured this, and it needed to be 42.5 inches. And you know me, I like to cut my borders just because it's easier and probably less risk of making a mistake. I fold them in half. So put your pin in the center, and then I cut this 21.25 inches long. So when you take that times 2, now we're at 42.5. Okay, so now I'm ready to mark the edge of my quilt because we also need to do that. And I will recommend that when you are sewing this first border on, particularly the top and the bottom, you want to make sure that you have your panel on top, because you can see you have all these seam allowances that could get flipped over on the back side if you were sewing it from the back with the black on top. So just make sure, in that way you can control where those seam allowances go. Okay, so that's half of it. Let's come pin the other half. You can tell I have a ravelly fabric again, and boy, I don't know how I always seem to get that kind, don't I? But I will make sure once I get my top all done, I go in and trim all of those so that you don't have any of those sneaking into your seam lines. So you can see how easy and how flat that lays when you cut the borders the size that you need them. I always recommend that we do that. So here I have another seam allowance, and I want to make sure that stays toward the border. So I'm just going to hold that as I shove it through there, as it pulls it through. Make sure that stays nice and flat. Okay, time to press again. I want this seam allowance to go toward the border, so I'm going to press it from the top so that it'll do that. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is, so now I've finished with this page of our downloadables, and you'll notice that I have in every instances when I'm measuring, I make a note right on my document so that I don't have to remember it. You won't remember it. You'll think of one that you had maybe on the last border, so you just need to make sure you jot those down. So let's measure across the top. You see how this is getting big enough? This will make a nice little throw, won't it? Okay, so now I can use my 24-inch ruler. And let's get one down here. And so this measures 18 1/4. And do you remember what I said that we needed to be a multiple of whatever the repeat is on our border? So if this is 18 1/4, and you take that times 2, it's 36 1/2. So that's exactly what we want, to be able to have 6 repeats of the border print along this edge, and the top and the bottom edge. Okay, so while we're here, let's go ahead and measure the length. One thing I'm going to do, and I always do this, I just want to make sure that the top and the bottom are the same. Okay, so now I'm going to fold it the other direction and get us the dimension, because we have a corner block in this second border. Okay, so now I know my ruler isn't going to be, oh yes it is. Okay, so on this side, since I started with 42 inches and we've added on 6 for the side borders, then it should be 48 1/2. And so right now I have 24 1/4. So this is exactly what I need to be able to put 8 repeats of the border print on this side. Okay, so now let's take our border prints. We're going to work on the top and the bottom first. So we'll do the top first. I'm going to take one of the border prints, and I told you to write those dimensions down, but I didn't, did I? And so I'm going to, we had 36 1/2 is the width, and 48 1/2 is the length. Now, I'm going to write my half, and I always write half equals 18 1/4. You might need that again, and half equals 24 1/4. So now you've got all of those dimensions written down. Okay, so let's see what we have to do to get 6 repeats. Now, again, I had 2 yards of this border print, and I did that so that I had more than enough to be able to decide which way I want the flowers to go, number one, and where I want to start the repeat. Let's start with the repeat right here on this edge. And it just so happened that if I cut where I've cut it here on the black line, there was a gold line next to that, that this measures 5 inches, so I can make a 4 1/2 inch finished wide border on it. Okay, so I'm going to draw myself a line right here. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to measure 36 1/2 inches, and then we'll come back and we'll double check and make sure we have 6 repeats in that space. So I'm going to start right here at the top of that flower, and we're going to come down here. Okay, I'm at 30 and 36. Okay, so now Now that I have my measurement, we still have to add a seam allowance onto that, okay? So that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to just take my little ruler, and we're going to add 1/4 of an inch. Get it so I can cut it in an angle that makes sense here. There's my line, and so I'm going to cut it at 1/4 of an inch beyond that. Okay, on that end. All right, so now I'm going to double check that. And you know, I don't use the measuring on the rotary mat very often, but it is a good way for you to double check. And this is 18 inches, so I'm just going to put my finger right there, and I'm going to come back here and I'm going to measure 18 inches. Okay, and so that's right on. So now I just need to take my line and add my seam allowance on here again. Okay, so for the top and bottom, I need to cut 2 like this. So now, I've been kind of toying of what we want to do with the direction, because you can see that these poppies kind of have a direction. And so I'm thinking that I'm going to make it so that the stems are going down all the way around. So here we go. So when I get ready to do the one on the side, the flowers are going to go down. So now when I get ready to do one across the bottom, the flowers are going to go the opposite direction. Now, we can kind of cheat on this a little bit because we've already measured this one. And now let's just find the repeat. Okay, there it is on this end. And now we can just lay it down flat. And so there's that little bit of that flower right there. And I can make a cut. All right, now I pinned this other end so I can come back here and I can make my other cut. Okay, so now I have the top and bottom borders ready to go. Again, we're going to pin just like we did before. Okay, and since I cut both of these at the same time, I'm actually going to pick this other one up and turn it around because you know I wanted the border to lay the other direction. And so that's going that way with the stems. This one's going this way with the stems. And pin it so that I have the right side when I get ready to pick this up to sew it on. I know some of you might think that I'm kind of putsy on putting these borders on, of pinning at the center and the ends like I do, but I can tell you your quilts will benefit from doing that. Okay, so now while I'm pinning, I'm going to go ahead and pin the other border on the bottom. And then, when we get ready to sew, we can sew both. Okay, now we're ready to sew. Okay, that's one border on. I will tell you another reason I like to use the thread savers like this is that you know how sometimes when you start sewing, your thread will come unthreaded? It won't happen if you have a thread saver in here because it's already sticking in a piece of fabric. Okay, so I'm going to press this. So again, I'm going to press the seam allowances toward the border. You'll notice as I'm pressing this, just like when we do half square triangles, of whatever piece you pick up and then put the iron down is where the seam allowance will fall. So you see that I'm just picking this up a little bit, and that way that seam allowance is going to fall exactly the way we want it to. So we'll be right back, and when we come back we're going to make the corner squares that connect the border around, and then we'll get those side borders sewn onto our quilt. Okay, I promised you that I would show you what I was going to do with the corners. Well, if you look at my drawing, you can see originally I was going to put a half square triangle and use some of my border print in that. And I made a couple. One didn't turn out at all because I trimmed it wrong. And this one, the design doesn't match right here. And so I decided I would do something different. And I took the large border print and cut me some 5-inch squares out of that and put those in the corner. So really what I've done is taken the design from the center of the quilt and put it in the border. Now, I did have a couple things happen. One, I cut one of my border strips too short. Well, after I sewed it together and ripped it out because the design didn't match exactly like it should, I want to tell you what I did because it worked really well. I went and got some Scotch tape, just transparent Scotch tape, and I cut it in half because I just really wanted a narrow piece. And I folded my design under so that I could match it on the top. And then where those lines had to meet, I put a piece of tape on this side, and I put a piece of tape on this side, and then I put another piece in the middle, and then I flipped it back and stitched it. And it was just perfect. And let me see if I can find it. It's right here. And anytime I have to do a splice like that, I tend to try to put those near the bottom of the quilt because your eye's going to be drawn right here in the center. And so even if it were off a smidgen, if it's way down here on the bottom of the quilt, nobody's going to see that splice that you put on there. And also, I had to piece my outer borders, the two side borders with the black, and I did the same thing with those. I just try to put those near the bottom of the quilt, and I try to never put it real close to the end because you don't want to have it all mixed up with your corner. I don't know about you, but I think this is a really, really fun panel, and it's bigger than I thought, and you know what? It would be real fun to curl up under this as a quilt, wouldn't it? Well, again, I want to thank you for joining us today, and we always want to thank our sponsors. Our sponsors provide some giveaway prizes, and some of you are going to win all of those prizes. So before you leave, be sure to check down in the description. You'll find the link to go register for that. I am a Bernina ambassador, and because I am, I'm able to offer you, if you purchase a new Bernina machine before December 14th, to send you a coupon where you'll get a $100 rebate directly from Bernina. This is not your dealer. This comes directly from Bernina. So if you'd like to have a coupon, or if you've purchased a machine in the last 3 or 4 weeks, it's during the lifetime of this class, I'll be happy to send you one of those coupons. And my email address is in the description. So send me a note with your mailing address, and I'll get a coupon in the mail as soon as I get it. And you know what? We have a brand new website, and everything now is on AmericanQuilter.com. We used to have QuiltWeek.com, we used to have Shop.com, and now they're all combined on AmericanQuilter.com. So if you're looking for anything for the American Quilter Society, It should all be in one place. That'll be easier for all of us to find the information. So don't forget to support our sponsors, Bernina, Branson, Ironmatic ironing boards, Panasonic irons, and I got to use that brand new one today, Tracy's tables, and Star Forest quilts. So be sure to register for all those prizes, because a week after the show closes, somebody's going to be a winner of some really neat stuff. Okay, our 6th lesson is going to be quilting Santa, and I can't wait to share that with you. We're going to be doing something different every single time for the borders on our panels. So until next time, we'll see you right here in the AQS studio working on another panel quilt.